The man had spent $2 million. He had flown engineers across 3 continents. He had wept, alone, in a parking garage, because the car his dead son once loved was dying, and nobody in the world could save it. And then a 12-year-old boy with engine grease under his fingernails walked in holding a mop. And in 30 seconds, he heard exactly what $2 million could not find. This is not a story about a car. This is a story about what happens when the world decides you don't belong in the room, and you walk in anyway. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a like on this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These stories travel further than I expect, and I want to know who's out there. There was an arrangement. Gloria Cole never spoke it aloud. She didn't need to. After 6 years of cleaning the service bay floors at Ashford Prestige Automotive in Millhaven, Virginia, the arrangement had become as structural as the building itself, as fixed and invisible as the load-bearing walls everyone walked past and never thought about. The arrangement was simple. Gloria existed at Ashford Prestige, but she did not matter at Ashford Prestige. She was the woman who kept the epoxy floors gleaming so that the men with certification badges and titanium cufflinks could walk across them without thinking about cleanliness. She arrived at 7 a.m. She left at 4 p.m. She did not make eye contact with clients. She did not offer opinions. She did not have a son. That last part of the arrangement was the one that required the most active maintenance. Because Gloria Cole did, in fact, have a son. His name was Elias. He was 12 years old. He had his mother's cheekbones and his late father's eyes, and a quality of stillness that made adults who noticed him vaguely uneasy. The stillness of a child who is absorbing everything, which is its own kind of thread in rooms that prefer not to be absorbed. On the afternoon of November 14th, Elias sat in the supply corridor off the main service bay with his backpack on his lap and his eyes doing what his eyes always did, moving, taking things apart, putting them back together. The car in Bay 4 was a 1966 Lamborghini 350 GT, metallic silver, long-bodied and impossibly low to the ground, the kind of silhouette that doesn't look engineered so much as imagined by someone who had never been told what was possible. 12 cylinders, 6 carburetors. Italian engineering from an era when the men who built these machines understood them the way surgeons understand the body, not from manuals but from touch. 7 technicians stood around it in the particular configuration of experts who have been losing to a problem for a long time. Elias watched them. He watched the way the one nearest the engine bay kept checking the same readout, as though the number might change if he looked often enough. He watched the 2 near the front conferring with the quiet urgency of men defending a position they'd already lost. He watched the senior technician, a woman named Clara Voss, 12-year veteran, certification patches on both shoulders, press her lips together and look at the car the way you look at a patient whose test results keep coming back clean when you know something is wrong. He watched all of this from a corridor, and then the engine was started. The V12 came to life beneath the service bay lights. 12 cylinders igniting in sequence, a sound like the clearing of a very old, very formal throat. The kind of sound that makes the floor vibrate at a frequency you feel before you hear it. The technicians watched their screens. Elias closed his eyes. He was in the corridor, 15 feet from the car, one hand resting on his backpack strap. He listened. 7 seconds, 12 seconds, 17, and then his eyes opened. Slowly, the way eyes open when they've found something. He sat with it for a moment, this thing he'd heard. This small, specific, impossible to ignore flutter buried inside the engine's breath. He sat with it the way Solomon had taught him. Don't rush toward what you hear. Let it come to you fully. Make sure you know what you're holding before you say its name. He knew what he was holding. And that's when Gloria Cole came around the corner from the far side of the bay, mop in hand, and saw her son sitting forward in a chair with an expression she recognized and feared in equal measure. Elias. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Her eyes were saying, "Please. Not here. Not today." He looked at her. "Mama," he said quietly, "I think I know what's wrong with that car." Her hand tightened on the mop handle. "Baby, I know I do." She stood there for a moment. A woman who had spent 6 years making herself invisible in this building. A woman who understood, with the hard-won precision of someone who could not afford mistakes, exactly what this moment cost. Exactly who would pay for it. Then keep it to yourself, she said, and turned back to the floor. Elias sat back. He looked at the car. He looked at the 7 technicians who had been losing to it for 16 months. He sat with the arrangement for exactly 45 more seconds. Then he stood up. "Excuse me." The words came out quiet, steadier than he felt. 3 technicians turned. The other 4 didn't, which told Elias something about how invisible he'd been. The one who turned fully, heavy-set, name tag, reading Marcus D. Lead Diagnostics, took him in with the specific expression of someone encountering a detail that doesn't fit the room. A kind of visual error message. "Can I help you, kid? I think I know what's wrong with the car." A beat. Then Marcus D. smiled. Not unkindly. Not entirely kindly either. The smile of a man who has just been told something too absurd to be insulting. "Yeah," he said. "And what makes you think?" "I heard it." Elias kept his voice even. "When you started it just now, there's an irregularity in the fuel delivery. It's not consistent enough to show up on your diagnostic readout because your equipment averages the readings and the drop is too brief to survive the average." He paused. "But it's there." The smile held, but it changed quality. Around the bay, the other technicians had stopped what they were doing. Clara Voss, the senior technician, turned fully from the car. She looked at him. Then she looked toward the corridor, where Gloria Cole had appeared in the doorway. Her mop was forgotten at her side. Her face held an expression Elias had never seen his mother wear at work, because his mother did not wear her feelings at work. But this expression had gotten past the arrangement. This one she couldn't hold back. It was terror, not anger, not embarrassment, pure, unvarnished fear. Marcus, the facility director, Brennan Ashford, materialized from the side office. Early 50s, navy blazer. The particular ease of a man whose last name was on the building. "What's going on over here?" "Nothing," Marcus said quickly. The cleaning lady's kid wandered in. I didn't wander," Elias said. The bay was quiet. Brennan Ashford looked at him with the patient, faintly contemptuous expression of a man who was deciding whether something required his attention or merely his dismissal. His eyes moved to Gloria. A message passed between them that did not need words. "Your son is a problem you need to manage." Gloria stepped forward. "Elias, we need to go. Let him speak." The voice came from the far end of the bay. Everyone turned. A man was standing near the entrance, unannounced, the way people enter spaces they own without announcement. 70s, silver-haired, walking with a cane that he clearly did not use for theater. He had the face of someone who had been living in a specific kind of grief long enough that it had rearranged his features, not destroyed them, just made them more honest than faces usually are. His name was Ellsworth Kane. He owned the Lamborghini. He had been standing in the doorway for 20 seconds, long enough to hear everything. He looked at Elias. "You said you heard something," Ellsworth said. "What did you hear?" The room did not breathe. Brennan Ashford began a sentence. "Mr. Kane, I think it's best if we—" "What did you hear?" Ellsworth said again. He wasn't loud. He was the opposite of loud. He was the specific quietness of a man who has stopped having patience for the theater of other people's authority. Elias looked at him. He looked at this man, this old, tired, grief-worn man, and saw something in his face that he recognized without being able to name yet. The way you recognize a language before you learn to speak it. He saw what the car meant. "The third carburetor from the driver's side," Elias said. "The float level is running high. Not high enough to throw a rich condition at idle. The carburetor self-corrects. But when the engine goes under load, there's a moment where the bowl overfills by just enough to push excess through the main jet. It creates a stumble, usually under hard acceleration, sometimes a stall on extended grades." He kept his eyes on Ellsworth. "Every time you test it at idle, everything reads within spec. Because at idle, it is within spec. The problem only lives at temperature under load." Silence. Clara Voss had gone still in the way that people go still when they hear something that reorganizes their understanding of a situation. Marcus D. was staring at Elias with his arms at his sides, which is a specific kind of attention that is different from crossed arms. Brennan Ashford said, "This is highly irregular." "How do you know that?" Ellsworth said, "Not prove it. Not that's impossible. Just, how do you know that?" The question landed differently than anything else in the room. Elias thought of a second-floor apartment 2 blocks from here. Machine oil and black coffee. 7 composition notebooks. A retired man with careful hands and failing eyes who had, for 5 years, given him the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. "Someone taught me," Elias said. "Someone who spent 40 years learning how these engines speak." Ellsworth Kane looked at him for a long moment. "Then let's hear it," he said. "Let me tell you about the November when Elias Cole was 7 years old. Let me tell you about a broken furnace and a neighbor who didn't plan to change anyone's life." His name was Solomon Greer, 67 years old, retired. First floor, Unit 1B, the apartment directly below the Coles. He smelled permanently of machine oil and black coffee, walked with the deliberate economy of someone whose knees had been through too much to waste steps, and had spent 4 decades working in vintage automotive restoration, specifically post-war European sports cars. The kind of machines most mechanics had never touched. The kind that required not just skill, but a particular quality of patience. The willingness to sit inside a problem until the problem trusted you enough to show you where it hurt. He had worked on Ferraris in the 1970s, Lamborghinis in the 1980s, a Maserati A6 GCS that came to him half destroyed and left running better than it had left the factory. He had shaken hands with men whose names were in the racing history books. He had forgotten more about Italian engines than most people would ever have the chance to learn. He had retired with bad knees, excellent hands, and a second bedroom converted into a workshop that smelled like 4 decades of accumulated knowledge. He had never had children. He had never had an audience. And then, on a gray November Tuesday, Gloria Cole knocked on his door and asked, with the specific dignity of a woman who did not ask for help easily, if her son could sit with him for the afternoon while she worked a double shift to cover the furnace repair bill. Solomon looked at the 7-year-old standing in the hallway with a backpack on and a winter coat unzipped. "Come in," he said. The first thing Elias said, 5 minutes later, standing over a disassembled carburetor spread across a card table like a mechanical map. "What's wrong with it?" Solomon had been about to explain what it was. He had a whole introduction prepared, the kind a patient man gives to a child who is being introduced to something unfamiliar. But something in the question stopped him. Not the words, the quality of them, the complete absence of performance. The kid wasn't being cute. He wasn't showing off. He was genuinely, urgently asking, the way you ask about something that matters to you before you even know why it matters. Solomon set down his coffee. "What do you think is wrong with it?" A test he hadn't intended to give. Elias studied the pieces. 30 seconds. 45. A minute, which is a long time to watch a 7-year-old study anything. Then he pointed. The float bowl. Not precisely right. Too young, knew too little. But pointing at the right section, drawn there by something instinctive, some quality of attention that recognized the location of a problem before it had the language to name it. Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, sit down. Let me show you something." 5 years passed. 5 years of Saturday afternoons, and summer mornings and evenings when Elias knocked on the door with his homework finished and 3 hours of daylight left. 5 years of composition notebooks. He filled 7 of them, and engine diagrams drawn by hand and questions written in the margins next to Solomon's answers. Solomon taught him the difference between a symptom and a cause, between what an engine was doing and why. He taught him to resist the convenient diagnosis, the one that fit the most obvious evidence, in favor of the correct one, which sometimes required being wrong in 4 different ways before you found it. He taught him one sentence that Elias wrote at the top of every notebook. The machine doesn't lie. Only the listener does, when they hear what they want instead of what's there. And on the afternoons when his eyes were too far gone to see the work, Solomon taught him something else, something that didn't have a name in any manual. He taught him to listen, not to the equipment, not to the readouts, to the machine itself. The way certain musicians can hear a wrong note in an orchestra of 40 before they can identify which instrument played it. Your hands are small, Solomon told him once. That's not a problem. In these old engines, small hands reach things that mine can't anymore. Your eyes are young. You see things I've stopped being able to see. He paused. And you hear things I've been trying for 40 years to teach other people to hear. Most of them never got it. He looked in Elias's direction, his eyes approximate now, landing nearby rather than precisely. You got it, 7. I don't know what to do with that except not waste it. Nobody at Ashford Prestige Automotive knew any of this. They saw a cleaning woman's son. They saw a child out of place. They saw everything except what was standing in front of them. Ellsworth Kane had owned the Lamborghini for 43 years. He had not bought it for investment. He had not bought it for status. He had bought it in 1981 at an estate sale because it had belonged to his father, and his father had died 2 years before, and the car had come up at auction, and Ellsworth had stood on the auction floor and made a decision with his hands before his mind caught up. His father had driven him to his first day of school in that car, had driven him to the airport the morning Ellsworth left for college, and stood on the curb watching him go with an expression Ellsworth only understood decades later. The expression of a parent watching their child become a person who no longer needs them, and loving them fiercely for it anyway. His son, Damien, had sat in the passenger seat for the first time at age 4, had learned to drive in it at 16, had been killed at 26 by a drunk driver on a county road 4 miles from home. The Lamborghini was the only place Ellsworth had ever found silence. Not silence the way an empty room is silent. Silence the way a conversation continues after the person is gone. When he drove it, the engine's voice filled the space where 2 other voices used to be. For 16 months, that voice had been wrong. Not broken. Not dead. Wrong. Off in some way that Ellsworth felt the way you feel a change in the air before a storm, below the threshold of language, in the body rather than the mind. He had brought it to Ashford Prestige because Brennan Ashford had come recommended by 3 people whose judgment he respected. He had paid 16 months of diagnostic fees and listened to 16 months of explanations that explained nothing and fixed nothing, and he had arrived at the facility that afternoon to tell Brennan Ashford, quietly, without drama, because Ellsworth Kane had grown too old for drama, that he was done. He was going to have the car transported to a museum, behind glass, where it would be safe and inaccessible and could no longer be killed slowly by men who did not understand it. He had been standing in the bay entrance, working up to saying this, when a child in the supply corridor spoke 12 words that reorganized the entire situation. I think I know what's wrong with that car. Ellsworth had stood there and listened and felt something happen in his chest that he had learned, by now, to be cautious about. Hope. He was 73 years old. Hope had cost him a great deal over the years. But 12 words in a child's careful voice had moved something. Let's hear it, he said. Brennan Ashford called it a supervised assessment. He called it that because it gave him the illusion of running something, and the illusion of running something was all that was left to him at this particular moment. He wrote a time on his clipboard. He positioned himself near the car in a way that was meant to communicate authority and communicated anxiety instead. The engine was running. Elias approached the Lamborghini. He did not reach for tools. He did not look at the diagnostic screen. He did not ask for the service history. He stood beside the open engine bay and closed his eyes. Marcus D. made a sound, not a word, a small exhale that carried an entire editorial inside it. 20 seconds passed. Ellsworth Kane stood near the bay entrance. His hands were on the head of his cane. He was watching the boy the way you watch something you are afraid to want. 30 seconds. Then Elias opened his eyes. He asked for one thing, an analog fuel pressure gauge, needle-based, from the 1960s if they had one. Marcus stared at him. We have a $50,000 diagnostic system. Your $50,000 system averages its readings over time, Elias said without sharpness. The pressure drop I'm looking for lasts less than 2 seconds. The average buries it. He looked at Marcus directly. An analog needle shows you exactly what happens in real time. It doesn't average anything. The bay was quiet. Clara Voss said, to no one in particular, check the storage room. They found it. Dusty. The cable stiff from disuse. buried under modern equipment that had failed, collectively, to do what a 12-year-old was about to ask of it. Elias connected the gauge to the fuel line, started the engine, watched the needle. The room watched the needle. At 4.4 psi, it held. Steady. 5 minutes. 8. 12. Marcus checked his watch. Someone near the back shifted their weight. 14 minutes. 16. At minute 18, the needle moved. A dip. 0.4 psi. Gone in less than 2 seconds. Then the needle steadied. There, Elias said. Quietly. The room had gone a specific, kind of silent, the silence of people recalibrating. Marcus said, "That's within normal tolerance." In a fuel-injected engine, yes, Elias said. The computer compensates. This engine has no computer. 6 Weber carburetors. No automatic compensation. The system expects perfectly consistent pressure. That 0.4 psi drop, brief, intermittent, invisible to your equipment, creates a lean moment in the third carburetor's bowl. Brief enough that you'd never feel it idle. Significant enough that under hard acceleration, on a long grade, in traffic, the engine stumbles, Clara Voss said. Quietly, almost to herself. Or stalls, Elias said. When conditions align badly enough. He turned to face the room. 12 years old. Engine grease under 2 fingernails. His mother's uniform reflected in the Lamborghini's silver paint behind him. 16 months, he said. Every test you ran was at idle, at cold start, or at operating temperature, but at rest. You never tested it at operating temperature, under load, over sustained time. A pause. No gloating in it. Just the quiet specificity of someone stating a fact that needed stating. The problem only lives in the intersection of those 3 things at once. I need you to sit with that for a second. Every expert who walked into that room brought everything they knew. Every certification, every tool, every diagnostic system money could buy. And what they didn't bring, couldn't bring, because they'd stopped practicing it, was the willingness to listen. To just listen. Without equipment. Without averaging. Without deciding in advance what the answer was going to be. I want you to ask yourself where in your own life you've stopped listening. Where you've let your expertise become a wall instead of a door. I want to bypass it, Elias said. Temporarily. A length of modern fuel-rated hose. Same diameter, same routing. Just new rubber in place of 60-year-old rubber for that one section near the exhaust manifold. He looked at Ellsworth Kane. If I'm right, the pressure fluctuation stops. If I'm wrong, nothing changes and you haven't lost anything except the time it takes me to connect 2 fittings. Brennan Ashford stepped forward. Absolutely not. You want to modify a $600,000 vehicle based on a correct diagnosis, Ellsworth said. A silence fell between them. Brennan's face shifted through several expressions. None of them landed comfortably. Mr. Kane, he began. The liability alone is mine to accept. Ellsworth met his eyes. It's my car, my liability, my decision. He looked at Elias. Do it. What happened next was not a performance. Elias worked the way Solomon had taught him to work. Not to be watched, but to get it right. Each movement deliberate. Each connection checked twice. His small hands moved into recesses that adult hands could not reach without removing additional components, and he reached them without removing anything. Marcus D. watched from 2 feet away. His arms were not crossed anymore. He was watching the way a craftsman watches another craftsman, with the specific quality of attention that recognizes skill across the boundaries of everything else. It took 11 minutes. Start it, Elias said. The Lamborghini came to life. The analog needle held at 4.4 psi. 5 minutes. Steady. 10. Steady. 18 minutes. The point where the needle had dipped before. Steady. 25 minutes. Not a single fluctuation. The engine ran the way it was built to run. Clean, even the specific acoustic signature of 12 Italian cylinders in their correct relationship with one another. Clara Voss crouched near the engine bay and just looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up and looked at Elias. I want to see the original line, she said. When we remove it, I want to see what's inside it. They removed it carefully. Elias held the flashlight while Clara made a small transverse cut with a razor blade. The inside of the rubber, the part no visual inspection ever reached, was cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly from outside. The cracks were fine as spider silk, the kind that only appeared under close examination with proper light. 60 years of heat cycles, thousands of expansions and contractions. The rubber doing what rubber does, invisibly, incrementally, until it didn't do it quite right anymore. How much? Ellsworth said quietly from behind them. The hose, Elias said. $30, maybe $40. The adjustment to the float level. 30 minutes of labor. He paused. The part that's actually broken isn't a part. It's just old. It's just tired. The bay was very quiet. Brennan Ashford was looking at his clipboard, though he wasn't writing anything. 16 months. The number hung in the room without anyone saying it. I need to drive it, Ellsworth said. Not a request. He pulled his keys from his coat pocket and looked at the car and looked at Elias. Ride with me. Brennan started. The insurance implications of a minor in the vehicle during an unscheduled. Ellsworth looked at him with an expression that ended the sentence cleanly. He opened the passenger door. Elias looked at his mother. Gloria Cole was standing near the bay entrance. Her mop was somewhere behind her, forgotten. She had not moved since the needle held steady at 18 minutes. She was looking at her son with an expression that had moved over the course of the last hour, from fear to something older and quieter than fear. She gave him the smallest nod. The door closed. The Lamborghini backed out of the bay into the pale November afternoon light. They drove north out of Millhaven, the road opening gradually into long curves. Ellsworth didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. He drove the way a person drives when they're listening to something. Hands easy on the wheel, body slightly forward, the specific posture of paying full attention. The engine climbed. Steady. Even. No stumble. No hesitation. No stau. When they reached the overpass at Route 9, the great Ellsworth had mentioned once to Brennan the specific incline where the car had twice died on him completely. The Lamborghini climbed it without a whisper of complaint. Ellsworth's hands tightened on the wheel, then slowly loosened. He drove for another mile before he spoke. I bought this car at an estate sale in 1981, he said. The weekend my father's things were auctioned off. I didn't bid on the furniture or the house or any of the things you'd expect a son to want. He paused. Just the car. Because I remembered being 4 years old in the passenger seat. I remembered what his voice sounded like against the engine noise. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been driving this car for 43 years, trying to remember that. Elias listened. My son drove it too, Ellsworth said. Damien, he loved it the way you love something that's slightly beyond you, with a little fear in it, which makes the love sharper. A pause. He died 11 years ago. Quel accident. 26 years old. The road ahead curved gently west. When the car started failing, Ellsworth said it felt like losing them again, like even that last thread was going. He didn't say anything more for a while. Elias looked out the window at the passing fields. He thought about his father, who died when he was 3, a man he remembered mostly in impressions. A voice, a smell, the weight of a hand. He thought about his mother and the specific bravery of a woman who carried grief and fear and dignity simultaneously without any of them canceling the others out. The car wasn't failing you, Elias said. Quietly. It was just tired. It needed someone to understand what was wrong. He paused. It needed someone to listen. Ellsworth was quiet for a long time. Then, very softly, he reached the highway on-ramp and opened the throttle. The Lamborghini responded the way it was meant to respond. Immediate, clean, powerful, honest. 12 cylinders singing. Ellsworth laughed. It was a small laugh. Private. Surprised by itself. That's it, he said. That's exactly it. He drove for 20 more minutes without saying another word. He didn't need to. They returned to Ashford Prestige at dusk. The bay lights were on. The technicians were still there. Nobody had left. Even the ones who weren't on shift anymore. There is a quality of waiting that keeps people in a room, and the room had that quality. Ellsworth Kane climbed out slowly, stood beside the car for a moment with his hand on the roof. 38 minutes, he said to the room. Every road that broke it, every grade, every condition. He looked up, not once. Nobody spoke. Brennan Ashford was holding his clipboard at a slight angle that communicated more than he intended. Clara Voss looked at Elias. The float level adjustment, she said. The warm specification check. The interior degradation of the rubber line. She said each thing as though placing it carefully. I've been doing this for 12 years. I didn't know about the warm specification memo. Most people don't, Elias said. It was in a footnote in the original service documentation. Factory memo from 1968. Stopped being included in reprints after 1975. Where did you learn that? Solomon Greer. He lives in my building. He worked on these cars in the 70s and 80s. Solomon Greer, Clara said carefully. The restorer? He was at the Beaumont workshop in Connecticut? Yes, ma'am. Clara looked at Elias for a long moment. I've heard of him, she said, in a tone that meant something specific. The tone of someone acknowledging a name that carries weight they had not previously connected to this situation. Here's what I want to ask you. Garrett Holloway, Brennan Ashford, whatever name you want to give that type of person. He's not unusual. He's the rule. Most institutions have one. Someone who got where they are through connections instead of competence. Someone whose authority was never tested the right way. What does an institution owe when that person gets exposed? What does the institution owe the people who were harmed by his being there? Drop your thoughts below, because I think that question matters more than any single story. Ellsworth Kane asked to meet Solomon. They drove there that evening. Ellsworth's car, Elias in the back, parked in front of the apartment building as the streetlights came on. Solomon answered the door in a cardigan with a coffee stain on one cuff and eyes that pointed in Elias's general direction and arrived approximately. Mr. Greer, Ellsworth said, I've been trying to save a 1966 Lamborghini 350 GT for 16 months. Solomon tilted his head. Your boy solved it in 30 minutes, Ellsworth said. Solomon was quiet for a moment. 45, he said. He would have wanted 45. He likes to be sure. Fair, Ellsworth said. May I come in? They talked for 4 hours. Solomon and Ellsworth in the two chairs. Elias on the floor in the doorway, his composition notebook open. Every 20 minutes or so, one of them would say something technical and Elias would quietly add a detail, and neither man was surprised anymore when he did. They talked about the cars they had both loved without owning. They talked about what it meant to understand something deeply, not intellectually, but in the body, in the hands, in the specific quality of attention that requires you to get out of your own way. They talked about their fathers. At one point, Ellsworth said, You knew this boy had something rare at 7 years old? At 7, Solomon said. Yes. And you spent 5 years teaching him. I spent 5 years trying to keep up with him, Solomon said. There's a difference. Ellsworth looked at the workshop through the open bedroom door. The tools on their hooks. The engine parts on the shelves. The photographs, Solomon at 30, at 40, at 50, always hands on something complex and beautiful. I'd like to do something, Ellsworth said. If you'll let me. Solomon turned his face toward him. I'm not interested in charity, Solomon said. I know, Ellsworth said. I'm interested in something else. 6 weeks later, a sign appeared above a restored workshop space on Calder Street in Millhaven. Greer and Cole Automotive. Vintage restoration and instruction. Not large. Not prestigious. The kind of sign that means something rather than announcing something. Ellsworth Kane had leased the space and funded the restoration of the equipment. He had done this quietly, with the specific grace of someone who understands that the gift that comes with strings attached is not a gift. One condition, offered not demanded, quarterly consultation on his collection. That was it. Solomon worked mornings. His eyes had stopped pretending to be better than they were, which he said was the first honest thing he'd done about them. Elias was his eyes in the morning. In the afternoons, Elias was in school. On the wall of the workshop, written in clean block letters on a piece of painted oak. The machine doesn't lie. Only the listener does, when they hear what they want instead of what's there. Clara Voss came on a Friday. She stood in the workshop doorway in street clothes and looked at the space and said, I've been thinking about the memo. The one you mentioned, the 1968 factory document. Elias looked up from the bench. It took me 2 weeks to find a copy, she said. It's in a private archive in Pennsylvania. Not digitized. not accessible without connections or money or knowing exactly where to look. She paused. There's information like that everywhere. Locked up, not because it's secret, just because nobody thought to make it available. Solomon turned toward her voice. There are 14 kids at the community center on Thursday evenings, she said. Kids who want to learn this work. No access, no connections, no idea that any of this knowledge exists. She looked at Elias. I thought maybe once a month you'd consider coming in. The workshop was quiet. Solomon looked in Elias's direction. Is Thursday workable? He said. Elias closed his notebook. Yes, he said. Marcus D. came on a Wednesday. Alone. He stood in the doorway with a thermos, set it on the near surface without mentioning it, and said, I've been doing this 16 years. I had credentials on the wall and a salary that told me I was good at it. He looked at his hands. A 12-year-old heard in 30 minutes what I hadn't heard in 16 months. Elias watched him. It doesn't mean you're bad at your work, Elias said. It means you were taught to trust equipment over your senses. You were taught that if the readout says it's fine, it's fine. He paused. Solomon taught me the readout is a translation. Sometimes things get lost in translation. Marcus stood with that. Can I come on Saturdays? He said. Elias looked at Solomon. Solomon's expression said, Your call. Saturday mornings, Elias said. 7 a.m. Older engines. Nothing with a computer. He almost smiled. Bring coffee for Solomon. He likes it strong. On a Thursday evening, 6 months later, Elias stood in front of 14 kids at the community center workshop. They range from 10 to 17. Some have been in trouble, so were looking for something to do with their hands. A few had the quality, that specific, quiet, unperformative attentiveness that Elias recognized because he had seen it in a mirror since he was 7 years old. On the bench between them sat a disassembled carburetor, the same type Solomon had spread across a card table 15 years earlier. Different carburetor. Same question. Don't touch it yet, Elias said. Just look. Close your eyes. Open them. Let your eyes land somewhere. Don't direct them. Let them find something. A girl named Priya, 11 years old, the youngest, the one whose questions arrived 3 years ahead of her, frowned. What if nothing feels wrong? Then nothing is wrong, Elias said. And you start by confirming that. There's nothing less useful than looking for a problem that isn't there. He paused. But if something feels off, even if you can't name it, point at it. Don't explain. Just point. The room was quiet. 14 kids looking at a carburetor with the specific quality of people learning to use a sense they'd been told didn't exist. Elias watched them. He thought about Solomon, about a November afternoon and a broken furnace and a retired man who answered a door and said come in without needing to know what it would cost him. He thought about what that single decision had built, not just in Elias, but in this room, in the 14 kids, in Clara Voss, who had given up 2 Thursdays a month and shown up every time, in Marcus, who arrived every Saturday at 6:55 with Solomon's coffee already poured. He thought about his mother, who had been afraid in that service bay, whose hands had gripped a mop handle because she knew what was at stake and couldn't afford not to know, and who had, in the end, given him the smallest nod, the nod that contained everything she was willing to risk. He thought about the arrangement, the way rooms are designed to make certain people invisible, the way invisibility is not a natural condition, but a constructed one, maintained by the people who benefit from it and dismantled slowly by the people who refuse. There's a thing I want to leave you with. Not about the car, not about the diagnosis, about Solomon Greer, who was 67 years old when a woman knocked on his door and asked if her son could sit with him for an afternoon, who spent 5 years teaching a kid that nobody else had thought to teach, not because it was his job, not because he expected anything, because a 7-year-old had looked at a disassembled carburetor and asked an honest question. And Solomon had recognized what that question was worth. There are Solomons everywhere. In apartments we pass every day. In buildings we enter and exit without looking at the first-floor windows. In retirement. In obscurity. In the quiet lives of people whose knowledge never made it onto a credential or a nameplate or a framed certificate behind glass. They carry decades of understanding that the world has simply decided not to look for in the places where they live. The question is never whether that knowledge exists. It does. The question is whether we are humble enough, still enough, honest enough to stop and look for it, to knock on the door, to sit down at the card table, to listen, not to the equipment, not to the readout, not to the average, to the thing itself. The machine doesn't lie. The room where Elias Cole stood with a mop in his hands and $1 billion worth of expertise arrayed against him. That room didn't lie either. It told him exactly what it thought of him. He listened, and then he told it something it hadn't expected. I know something you don't. And he was right. If this story reached something in you, subscribe to Orvin Stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave me one comment. Tell me about your Solomon. The person who taught you something the world didn't think you were supposed to know. I want to read every one, because those stories, those quiet, uncredentialed, unsponsored acts of one person deciding another person was worth teaching, those are the stories that actually change things. Every machine tells you what's wrong. Every person does too. The only question is whether you're humble enough to listen.